morning, everyone. We had the fall of modern European civilization due to the decline of organized religion.
Francesco Molteni, a sociologist at the University of Milan, conducted research that proved that childhood development and habits formed during young ages are responsible for religious decline in Europe today. Quote, as members of the older, more religious cohorts die, they are replaced by younger, less religious ones, thus resulting in an overall religious decline, end quote. This study, although conducted in 2022, is still applicable to the development of religion in the entirety of modern European civilization. This development of less religious people created questions about the organized Catholic Church, as well as the authority of religious figures like the Pope. Organized religions then fell in size and overall support from both the European population and their governments, and with this came the Reformation. Organized religious infighting between Catholics and Protestants, and even among Protestants themselves, destroyed the unity organized religion had given to Europe. The Marburg Colloquy is an example of this infighting. There was room for compromise, yet little agreement was had, fractioning the Protestants further between themselves, even though the event was supposed to spark unity and religious harmony. Helmut Königsberger, in his The Unity of the Church and the Reformation, asserts that there was an increasing political tension between the monarchies and the papacy over the control of the institution of the church. This emphasis of the loss of authority of organized religion on states' governments and a battle of monarchs against the papacy. With people and monarchies questioning the authority and legitimacy of the different churches, organized churches tried to crack down on people leaving the church and tried to double down on religious morals. The biggest example of this is the Catholic Jesuits and the Counter-Reformation. Ignatius of Loyola, the creator of the Jesuits, in his Spiritual Exercises, Chapter 10, Rules for Thinking with the Church, shows a list of rules for the Catholic Church. This document shows resistance to new ideas, stating, quote, we must put aside all judgment of our own and keep the mind ever ready and prompt to obey in all things the hierarchical church. And, quote, we should be more ready to approve and praise the orders of our superiors than to find fault with them, end quote. These quotes show how the Catholic Church wanted to return to the unthinking support of its followers. Protestants were no different, though. In John Calvin's Genevan Ecclesiastical Ordinances, he created some of the same rules set by the Jesuits. Quote, he who contradicts the word of God shall be sent before the council for punishment, end quote. This reinforcement of church morals failed overall to reinterest anyone. Instead, it created a moral black hole, as well as more religious hate. The biggest event was the 30s-year War. Historian Peter Wilson states that the outbreak of the war and the length of the war were not inevitable, and that none of the problems that led to the war were unsolvable. He claims, though, that militants, people engulfed with this religious hate and loss of religious morals, presented the problems as unsolvable, and they deliberately inflamed them. Another big event was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This is another event that shows the loss of reason as well as the loss of Christian morals. Overall, there were those who urged reason, with some who generally believed that war was contrary to the interests of faith. Yet members of religious hate sparked the decline of organized religion in Europe.
After this collapse of a centralized religion, primarily the Catholic Church within Europe, the question of theology was had by all Christians. And this discussion is still going on today. But that's not the primary focus. The primary focus was what was left by the wayside because of this discussion, and that was the morality and the morals of all Europeans during this time, during this collapse of religion. The two primary points I want to focus on, the first one being uniform morals. Because of this collapse, uniform morals were not the same. They were not the same across all Europeans. The second one is this gap left because of the collapse of this structured religion, easily taken over by other things. Organized religion was the basis for moral beliefs that Europeans held on to for so long. A split for major groups led European people to a different set of morality. That can be easily seen through the artwork of the time and how it evolved. Their art gives us an insight into how they valued, a strict, sinless life, which can be seen in this first artwork right here, The Night, Death, and the Devil, where they had a clear goal in mind in their life. They were leading towards heaven. So that's what they valued. They valued a strict, sinless life, leading to an overall spiritual life leading to heaven. They had a purpose. But this changed. Now the focus was less spiritual, and it was a more deprived state of being across Europe. Like I said, the theology of church wasn't as in question, but the stress of importance of the church's morals changed. Branches of Christian theology developed in different areas overall weakened the morals as a whole. Alexander Pope's Essay on Man, for example, clearly talks on a split of overall beliefs, leading more towards a decline on morals. Realism. Realism now became a basis for morals. It became an objective reality, most being founded in innate human character. Now, this had been never seen before until the weakening church. It left a gap that this can now take over. This would never gain a foothold that it did without that void. Philosophers such as Voltaire discussing individualism and innate morals, not needing religion to dictate morality. His works such as his novel Candide discussing worldly chaos that no just God would cause. Realism, Rachel Rousk's Flowers in a Vase is another example of art showing these moral declining. It shows the withering of life, not necessarily leading towards heaven anymore, a clear contrast between the other artwork, Night, Death, and the Devil. It shows a devoid state of being, a devoid life, and because of this strong religious fervor in regards back to morality. The void I mentioned was quick to be taken over by these different areas because the need for morality still existed in all people across Europe. But what would take over wouldn't just be objectively worse, but factually worse.
As European civilization moved away from religious authority, extreme ideologies eroded traditional values and destabilized societal norms. Ignited by the rise of nationalism, communism, and others, Europe lost what was cemented by organized religious morals and ethics. The doctrine of religion was on objective moral standards. However corrupt those leaders might have been, religion provided Europe with a solid line that distinguished right and wrong in European culture. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, ideologies led people to rationalize different ways of thinking and provided the motivation for actions that contradicted traditional religious values. So much so that people began valuing their own national loyalty above religious faith and challenged the governmental church leaders. Nationalism, an ideology that focused on the country as a central priority, asserted itself to a point that religion was not only pushed aside, but became an opponent to its doctrine. Unity and solidarity could not exist alongside the church's authority. In Lenin's April thesis, presented in 1917, called for the overthrow of the provisional government and a transition to socialism. The movement contradicted rulings and moral concepts of the church. Their absolute rule then moved people to atheist beliefs away from the church's doctrine. Lenin's implications outline for us how nationalist sentiments and aspirations intersected with broadened political movements such as communism. Communism began as an ideology and political theory that allowed for the communal sharing of resources. This theory evolved from nationalism. However, this ideology transformed into an extreme political platform that ultimately bestowed total authority to the government. Karl Marx, popularly considered the father of communism, outlined his ideology in his works titled The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. These works outline the optimal theories challenging established governmental powers and economic systems. Karl Marx was so influential that his theory ignited a movement that not only affected Germany and Europe, but changed the entire world. He had a profound impact on the nationalist movement, and eventually his philosophy was indoctrinated and had no room for religious authority. It called for social change and collective responsibility. It turned, however, to the rejection of all challengers and subjectification of traditional morals and ethics. Eventually, communist movements based on Marxist principles engaged in revolutionary practices to overthrow capitalistic and religious systems. Various countries attempted to implement these systems, such as China and the Soviet Union, as well as others. However, modifications to Marx's intentions brought about even more extreme ideas and strategies leading farther away from practical morals. Communism, as we know today, is a complex interplay of theory, practice, and historical context that not only reshaped the countries that adopted the ideology, but it also transformed Europe and the rest of the world. Extreme ideologies, particularly nationalism and communism, forced the world to move away from the challenging authority of religious doctrine, and therefore muddied the waters of moral and ethical standards. Ultimately, the rise of nationalism and communism directly impacted the decline of European civilization.
These extreme ideologies that were adopted in Europe were ineffective. They were unable to create a common moral framework for the European people, and instead they incited violence in the name of expansion. This violence would lead to the direct decline of European civilization. The first problem is that not one singular ideology was followed perfectly by everyone. As Ben had talked about before, the division between religion at the early part of this era was the same as the division of the ideologies now. This was because each one needed to spread their influence completely. We see in Hitler, as he wrote in Mein Kampf, how he had to reach the masses with propaganda to try to spread their beliefs as most as they could. This is also seen in the Nazi Party's movement, as Protestant youth leader was able to report how the youth were following the movement not because of the ideals or morals of it, but actually because of the energy and the spread of it moving around the country. Giuliano Comides wrote in his paper, "The Vatican, Nazi Fascism, and the Making of Transnational Anti-Communism in the 1930s, that the Vatican was forced to work with the Nazi Party as they were going against communism. Communism advocated for atheism in the place of equality for everyone, so the church was forced to look to a power of an extreme ideology to get the power to move against communism." We also see in a speech by Lenin on the importance of spreading communism to the youth, much as Hitler understood as well. They understood that reaching the youth would allow them to grow a country with that ideology set and spread it among the people faster. However, the spread was not enough. Every ideology needed full control of the entirety of Europe, as the church had had before this era. This led to violence between the ideological groups. Loren Langman wrote, and I quote, "Fascism combined the adulation of a violent hero with an orderly nation state of united people whose leadership expressed their collective will with violence if necessary." We see on a graph from Northeim, Germany, as more political meetings were had in the city, there were also more fights among the political parties. We also eventually get to see these dots, which are groups of more than 20 participants that ended up in mobs or riots. Even Hitler and the Nazi Party advocated violence for the spread, as he wrote in his secret book that not by foreign policy and not by foreign trade could Nazi Germany become superior, but by attacking and invading Soviet Russia to take on and enslave the Bolshevik Jews that were inferior to them. Violence led to war, and war was the ultimate downfall of any hope for Europe to combine as one power source. War spreads confusion and disunity. And we can see this in a poem called Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, where he points out the horror and monstrosities of war and how it is not what they were told to be prideful about when they went into it. Hida Kovali also wrote how in concentration camps, returning home to Poland, how confusion spread among the people and they were forced to look to the Soviet Union for any power because the people were so confused on what to follow. The best visual of the horror and confusion is by George Gross, I Am Glad I Came Back. This depicts a skeleton, Death, a man returning home from war in tattered rags, to open the curtains to his home, only to see the utter hell and destructive landscape that is left behind. This is due to the pride and ideologies failing and causing more disarray and the downfall of European civilization.
As for a larger scope with more research and more implications, we want to draw similarities to 16th century religion between Catholics and Protestants, World War II ideologies like Nazism and communism, and even the Cold War split between democracy and communism. Because all three of these splits, as ideologies, none of these splits could stand with both sides intact. One had to come out on top. Their solution for unity so far has been the European Union. This is a movement away from the United States as a main influential force, and we want to look more at how the European Union works with our our theory on the splits. And therefore, the collapse of organized religion led to Europe's decline. Any questions?
Questions from the audience? Joe?
So if Europe would have remained Catholic, would Europe have declined?
That's what